Newlands on Consumer Protection. I'm Bobby Gray. I'm the Associate Vice President of Programs at Grameen Foundation. We're an international nonprofit organization with deep roots in the microfinance movement, and more recently have been spending time looking at the social and gender norms that really inhibit vulnerable populations access to and benefit from financial services, which brings us to the topic that we're discussing today. I have the pleasure to be joined with three awesome colleagues today: Amelia Greenberg from the Social Performance Task Force in Cerise, William Blackman from Innovations for Poverty Action, and Ramo Palazzi from Nedbank in South Africa. And as we get started, just want to acknowledge that we're actually in Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So it's timely for us to be talking about financial abuse and its connection to financial services and domestic violence. We're going to first define what financial abuse is before we get started. And I'll just say that this presentation or this conversation that we're having today is kind of a second one. We introduced this topic last year, and so we're thrilled to be able to bring to this year's conference conversations about the data that we've been collecting within the sector to help us really understand what financial abuse is. But financial abuse is the controlling or restraining a person's ability to acquire, use, or maintain economic resources to which they are entitled. This can include coercion, fraud, manipulation that restricts a person's access to money, assets, credit, or financial information. And really, it's basically a trusted person who is using financial services to control another person or abuse them. There are lots of definitions that you'll see out there on this topic, but the essence of it is somebody's using financial services to control and harm somebody else. There are different forms of financial abuse. There's financial exploitation, financial control, and financial sabotage. Financial exploitation is experiences such as coerced or fraudulent debt. So when we kind of look at the relationship between the efforts within the sector to address fraud, financial abuse can look like a form of fraud when someone's taking out credit in someone else's name or using some of their resources without permission. It can be refusing to pay bills, ruining a credit score, spending large amounts of money of jointly held money, savings accounts, etc. It can also be limiting someone's access to the financial services that they have access to, using language barriers to misrepresent financial decisions. And under financial sabotage, one of the more interesting and kind of alarming ways that abusers can use financial services is through digital stalking. So if you think of your digital payment apps in the United States, these would be Venmo, Zelle, Cash App, using the memo lines to actually send threatening messages, sending very small payments to someone to send threatening messages. We don't really know what the prevalence of financial abuse is, so we have to rely on statistics of domestic violence statistics because financial abuse is a form of domestic abuse, and in many countries it's written into law that it's illegal. But what we do know is that when someone is reporting or experiencing some form of physical or sexual violence, 99% of the time they're experiencing financial abuse. So 1 in 3 women globally, as well as in the United States, experience some sort of domestic violence during their lifetime. We don't really know the statistics for men, but I'm going to rely on a statistic in the US that says about 1 in 10 men will also experience some form of domestic violence. The number one reason why victims, survivors stay in abusive relationships is because they can't afford to leave or stay safe. And I read a statistic somewhere that oftentimes when somebody leaves an abusive relationship, they'll leave behind 3/4 of their assets or resources just to flee an abusive relationship. And that research shows that victim survivors may be more likely to disclose financial abuse to a financial institution than to the police or other domestic violence survivor advocacy organizations. So I'm going to invite my colleague Amelia to share some of the research that the Social Performance Task Force has been engaging in on measuring forms of financial abuse. Amelia, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, hi. I will start my remarks by saying that when I first got into this topic and I was talking with Bobby and others about how this is a customer protection issue, there was sort of an open question of how much of a role does a financial service provider play in this space? If someone is a victim of financial abuse, are there actions that not only could a financial service provider take, but should they take? And one of the prevailing pieces of wisdom was, if you're going to work with a financial service provider on this issue, start by interviewing their customers to see if this is a problem, because having data on whether this occurs not just generally in the world, but specifically with your own customers can be a really strong entry point for buy-in and engagement by the financial service provider. And that was definitely the case. We worked with 2 different financial service providers in sub-Saharan Africa, and both of them were quite interested to know from the beginning whether this was a problem among their customers. And we did a phone survey. In each case, it was about 200 customers, all women in this case, although financial abuse doesn't always happen to women, but they serve women. So we interviewed a representative sample of their customers, and we had different types of questions in our survey instrument. But this slide shows the responses to the questions that could be answered with, yes, this happens to me, or no, this doesn't happen to me. And so there are 9 different questions here represented. The blue is the first financial institution, the orange is the second one. And you can see, depending on the type of abuse, how common it was among the customers surveyed. So some of the types of abuse, such as earnings have been taken against the will of the customer, or that the person reported that she had been obligated to give money to her spouse or to her partner. Those answers seem to be not confirmed by a very large percentage of the population. So it's about 2% that you can see said yes to that. There were other types of abuse where people said, yes, this has happened to me more frequently. One, you can see financial information being withheld, or just a sort of a control aspect. Where the person is demanding to know how the woman spent her money. Another common one is that the woman lent money from her own loan capital to her spouse or partner, and then that person never repaid it. And then one of the most common in both institutions was feedback that when a woman started earning her own money, it caused the spouse to then contribute less towards basic household expenses. So he would say, oh, now that you're earning money, I don't have to pay for food, or I don't have to pay for our kids' school fees. And so that created a lot of friction in the household as well. And you can go to the next slide, Bobby. Then we also had in this survey a mix of questions that are sort of more or less severe in terms of what type of abuse people are experiencing. And this one, I think, would be indicative of a particularly troublesome type of abuse where you are afraid of your partner. So you can see that most of the people in most institutions said this was not the case for them. But in one institution, 8%, and in the other institution, 7% said they are sometimes afraid of their partner, and then a small percentage said they were frequently afraid. So this is happening, and the customers for whom this is happening would find this to be a particularly dangerous situation for them to be in. And so this would then cause the financial service provider to say, okay, are we going to intervene? Are we going to intervene in different ways depending on what people are experiencing? And then for something as dangerous as this, maybe we need a stronger and more rapid intervention than for some of the other types of abuse. Next slide. And then we also did a sort of an analytics where we said, okay, we've asked a lot of questions. In total, there were about 15 where we're talking about different types of abuse. And we wanted to tabulate how many people said yes to at least one of them. And that was a much bigger percentage. So even though for individual questions, the number of people reporting, yes, this has happened to me, was a distinct minority of the overall surveyed population. When you look at these numbers and say how many customers responded at least yes to one thing, it is in one institution's case 45% or more, and then the other, or I guess 45 is responded to yes to between 1 and 4 questions, and for the other 43% responded yes to at least 1 to 4 questions. And we grouped that sort of arbitrarily, but we decided if you said yes to between 1 and 4 of them, you were in a low risk group. If you said yes to 5 to 9 questions, you were at moderate risk, and then 10 to 17, so 17 total questions if you include the qualitative ones, then we would say you're high risk. So you can see very tiny percent in the high risk category, but some significant numbers in the moderate risk, and then a big chunk of customers in this low risk group. So these numbers do indicate that a significant portion of the customer base is experiencing some sort of financial abuse. Let's go to the next slide. What was then very interesting is that we concluded our survey by saying, okay, now let's stop talking about you personally, but let's talk about your community. So in your community, in your village, among your friends and family, does financial abuse exist, essentially? You know, the conflicts about money leading to some sort of mistreatment or abuse. And you can see from these results that then the answers were very much skewed toward yes. So at first, this seemed like a little bit of a disparity between the lower number of people saying, yes, this has happened to me, and the higher number of people saying this most definitely happens in my community, especially because all of these people that we interviewed were the other members of their community, right? They're all from the same region. But you can see that overwhelmingly in both institutions, people said, yes, this happens. And then, you know, a very small number said either I don't know or no, it does not. So then we had a qualitative question to follow up on that quantitative one about, you know, does abuse happen? And said, well, what kind of mistreatment or abuse do women experience? So, and this is again based on sort of conflicts about money. And I've organized the results here by what was most frequently mentioned, and it's a little bit tricky because what was most frequently mentioned is different from one institution to another. But you can see violence. This could be sexual violence, physical violence, was very frequently mentioned. And then eviction from the home is also high. Refusal to pay for household needs, which we discussed before, very high in both institutions. Some said it takes the form of women not being allowed to work or have her own money, stealing from the wife. You get to a smaller percentage of these other types of abuses, but still they were mentioned by more than one person. So psychological harm, threats, insults. Some women knew that the husband had contracted debt in her own name. Some reported their spouses exercise too much control or total control over how the woman spends her own money. In some cases, a very few number of cases, but some women talk about being forced to work. This idea of taking loans from the wife and not repaying, which we talked about earlier. Abandonment, divorce, just generally fights, destruction of property, and then infidelity. And note that these numbers don't necessarily add up to 100 because definitely in a lot of cases, people mention more than one type of abuse was possible. So from this, last thing I'll say, and then I'll give it back to you, Bobby, is that we brought these results to the financial service providers and we said, is it useful for you to know this information? And both of them said definitely yes. And that there's a lot of ways that a financial service provider can help, and Bobby will get into them more. But the quick ones that they brainstormed just off the top of their head are, first of all, on the area of confidentiality, sort of how much does a spouse need to be informed about what access his wife has to loans. So that's something that a financial service provider can think about as they think about their guarantor requirements or their ID requirements or their documentation. Is any of that policy, are any of those policy decisions going to somehow make it so that the spouse needs to be informed of the woman's financial activities? And then they also both spoke at length about the training that they provide to tell women, you know, here's how to separate your own business finances from your personal finances, and what are your rights and your obligations as someone who gets a loan. So it was definitely food for thought for them, and we are interested in trying this kind of survey instruments, or refining it and collecting more data on it. But certainly a key takeaway is that not only is this a problem, but it does affect the financial sustainability of a financial institution, to the extent that if a woman cannot manage her finances the way she wants to, she's going to be less successful in her business and therefore less successful as a customer. And also the flip, that if you can work with your customers, there's a, sort of a trust and a customer loyalty kind of building process that can happen through that relationship of caring how she's doing and making sure that you're not in some way through your own policies or modes of operating, making her at higher risk for this kind of abuse. So back to you, Bobby.
Great. Thank you, Amelia. Now we're going to go to William Blackman from Innovations for Poverty Action. One thing that I'm super thrilled about is that he does have data to also bring to the table. And some of this was opportunistic. So I appreciate IPA engaging with us and looking at even the questions that we had used in sub-Saharan Africa to consider how to add certain types of questions to IPA's financial consumer protection surveys. And so today, I think a lot of this data is hot off the press, and I'm excited to hear from William to share some of the lessons and some of the data that you have. William, over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And just quickly, thank you for the opportunity to be here and really excited for this conversation. Thank you for organizing, Bobby. So I'm an associate director at Innovations for Poverty Action, or IPA, which is a global research and policy organization. I oversee our financial consumer protection work. And as part of our consumer protection research initiative, IPA, as Bobby mentioned, is in the midst of carrying out a large-scale multi-country survey. We're focused on surveying digital financial services users and trying to understand the challenges that they face. And so we focus on a variety of challenges, pricing transparency issues, over-indebtedness, fraud, the complaints redress process. And this year, as Bobby mentioned, we've added questions on financial abuse, which we've come to realize recently is really actually an important component of consumer protection. So as of today, we've completed data collection in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Nigeria, and the Philippines. So I'll be sharing results from those countries, except Nigeria, where we didn't include the financial abuse questions. And then we will also soon be launching data collection in 5 other countries, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, and Pakistan. So you can look forward to the results from those next year. We're also going to be conducting another round of these surveys in 2027, so you can look at changes over time. Yeah, next slide, thank you. So what did we do in terms of financial abuse? We added a short module, just 4 questions on financial abuse. So we asked, our goal was to understand sort of controlling behavior and unauthorized actions involving money and financial accounts within intimate or household relationships. So we asked respondents whether someone had accessed their financial account without permission, if they themselves were prevented from accessing their financial account by someone else, if someone had taken a loan, I should say, without their consent, or if they had experienced a conflict or argument about their finances within the household. Next slide. So before diving into these results, I do want to caveat this in a couple of ways. First, we asked whether a partner or a household decision maker had taken any of these actions. And so for a few respondents, particularly adult children living with their parents, this could reflect a parent-child dynamic rather than an intimate partner relationship, which is obviously going to be different. And the last indicator in particularly is not necessarily a sign of financial abuse. We know that conflicts or arguments about how household funds are spent is not always going to be reflective of coercion or control. It can reflect sort of financial stress or unhealthy dynamics, but that's not necessarily financial abuse. Finally, with all types of sort of sensitive topics, we are concerned about underreporting. So some respondents may have withheld information, even in anonymous surveys like this. And I'll come back at the end of my talk about why we think that might be. But for now, it's just important to think of these as sort of lower bounds on the true prevalence. So with that in mind, what we see overall is quite similar to what Amelia had shared earlier, that the overall levels of financial abuse are relatively low. And they were relatively consistent across countries, though the Philippines does stand out as the one non-African market in this in the sample thus far. We see that financial conflict and prevented account access is a bit higher than in our African markets, which could either mean higher rates of true financial sort of control or it could reflect a greater willingness to just talk about these types of experiences. So I'll do a deep dive on each of these and then talk about the methods a little bit. Next slide. Okay, so focusing first on unauthorized access to accounts. We see that the highest rates are among working class adults, so those between age 26 and 45. We also see that urban consumers are reporting more unauthorized access to their accounts than rural consumers. Next slide. Here we're looking at cases of where a partner or a household member prevented someone from accessing their own account or their own money. And here we see that there's higher rates among younger consumers and those with a secondary education. The gender pattern here, I think, is pretty interesting. Men are reporting being blocked twice, blocked from their accounts twice as often as women, 6% versus 3%. So does that mean that men are more often victims of financial control than women, which would be sort of the opposite of what Bobby was saying before? Not necessarily. It could also reflect differences in how people are interpreting this question. In many households, women's access to money is sort of already mediated through a partner's account. And so they may not view themselves as being blocked from an account that they don't actually own themselves to begin with. Next slide. So the next indicator looks at unauthorized loans, cases where a partner or a household member took out credit in someone else's name or in the respondent's name without their consent. We see an age gradient here. Rates are roughly doubling from 2% among younger adults to 4% among older adults. And we also see that urban residents are reporting slightly higher rates than rural ones, 3% versus 2%. Next slide. Finally, we're going to look at financial conflict, disagreements or arguments about money, about financial accounts within the household. This is the most commonly reported indicator. Roughly 1 in 10 of the respondents that we interviewed said that they experienced some form of financial conflict with a partner or a household member. The rates are higher among older adults and among men. It is interesting to see that disagreements are typically going to involve both a male and a female partner. Yet we see this big or a significant difference by gender. So this almost certainly is driven by differences in interpretation of what a conflict means and their willingness to report conflicts like this to surveyors. Okay, next slide. So a big sort of methods question: can we really trust survey data? I think it's an important question, particularly because of the sensitivity of these types of questions, this content. First off, surveys are only as representative as the people that we reach in our surveys. And so sampling bias is always going to be a concern for us. We also know that respondents tend to underreport experiences, experiences that are sensitive or stigmatized or embarrassing, what we researchers would call social desirability bias. So what can we do about this? There's a few sort of ways to mitigate these types of issues. We can think about recruitment strategies for surveyors. So online surveys in contexts where digital literacy is limited can lead to a biased sample. We can also think really carefully about question wording, and this speaks to what Amelia had mentioned before. We try to use normalizing language that can sort of minimize stigmatization, and also use third-party language. So instead of saying, do you yourself experience these issues, you can say, do people in your community experience these issues? And Amelia spoke to this quite nicely. Another trick is list experiments, which let respondents indicate how many statements apply to them without revealing which statements apply to them, so that researchers can estimate the true overall rate of sensitive behaviors while preserving anonymity for individuals. Another consideration is the mode of data collection. So self-administered questionnaires can be helpful in mitigating social desirability bias, but you do need to be wary of sampling bias that can be introduced through online self-administered surveys. We tend to prefer in-person surveys over phone surveys, though we recognize that there's trade-offs. In-person surveys allow enumerators to establish rapport and trust. And then finally, survey data shouldn't be used alone. We know that there are these limitations, and so it's important to pair quantitative work, like the work that IPA often does, with qualitative interviews, focus group discussions that can be, very useful in revealing this type of information. Very quickly, last slide. Just to say, we'll have more data coming out soon. You can visit this link right now for the data that we have, and over the coming year, we'll have additional data coming out. So I'll turn it back to Bobby. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, William. And it's great to see. I think it's validating to see that the rates that you have across these other surveys are actually pretty consistent with the data that Amelia was presenting, which I think is really interesting, even though, the types of questions that you asked were, much smaller in number than what we had. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ramo. We're super excited to have Ramo here representing Nedbank in South Africa. I think you'll find his presentation and his perspective really inspirational. It's really great to see an example of a financial institution being very bold in their action on financial abuse. So without further ado, Ramo, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Bobby, thank you so much. Bobby, I can assure you, you're nowhere near as excited as I am. Just to lift the veil a little bit on the work we've done and really the lessons that we're learning, because it's such early days for us. But I think probably more excited to have the opportunity to learn from you guys. It's incredible the work you guys are doing. Super, super happy to be here. So maybe I'll begin, Bobby, and attendees, with explaining why on earth is a bank looking at financial abuse and choosing to intentionally address it. So one of the responsibilities the team I look after has, amongst others, is something we call purpose innovation. So this is really looking to develop innovative, value-creating, sustainable solutions at the intersection of social challenges and our core capabilities as a bank, given that Nedbank is a purpose-led organization and we sort of really hang our hat on being financial experts who do good. So naturally, that sort of led us through the same statistics that Bobby shared earlier, realizing how prevalent financial abuse is in gender-based violence and how, it's just kind of pervasive that social ill is in the community that we exist in. And the notion that you can be a successful organization in an ailing society is impossible to even fathom. So we had to do something about it. So folks, I suppose let me take you back to November 2024. We launched a campaign called the Money Warnings Campaign to really sort of surface a simple truth, that money in the wrong hands can and is being used to abuse women primarily. So what we did is we ran a warning label, as you can see in the background image here, not dissimilar to what you'd see on tobacco products or other controlled products like alcohol, just really kind of communicating this to draw the public's attention to this reality, because the reality of financial abuse is that it tends to live in it's almost hidden in plain sight in a sense. So Bobby, if we go on to the next slide. So fast forward to this year, recognizing that we had taken all these efforts to drive this awareness campaign, but given our ambition, around purpose-led innovation and given who we are really as Nedbank, we knew we had to do more to move from awareness, if you will, to action. Now, as experienced designers, we're taught a fundamental question is to ask yourself, who am I solving with, right? Or who am I solving for? And immediately we find ourselves out of our comfort zone, because the thing about financial abuse is that it's prevalent, it's evident across the socioeconomic spectrum. It might express in different ways and perhaps require, sort of different responses and solutions. But, the notion of who you're solving for falls away when you're solving for everyone. Bobby, if we move forward, please. But what we did do is we were keenly aware that we were stepping well outside of our comfort zone, and we're very mindful of what we didn't know. So we very aggressively consulted with SMEs, people who work with people impacted and affected by financial abuse on a daily basis, and who understand and know so much more than we could possibly hope to. And one of the takeaways, there's so many more that I would love to share given the time, but I think one of the primary takeaways we took from those SME or subject matter expert engagements, was this idea of this continuum of care that, as there are a range of interventions, but that the complexity and the requirement for specialized interventions, sort of increase, sort of throughout this sort of continuum of care, if you will. And therefore, it kind of guided us as NEPING to say we need to be very mindful about where we have legitimacy and relevance to intervene. For all the best intentions in the world, we wanted to make sure that we avoid doing more harm than good, if that makes sense. So if we go on to the next slide, we really kind of situated ourselves in what our SMEs reference as prevention, but appreciating that this prevention expresses in different ways. There's this notion of awareness, and in fact, Bobby, if you don't mind, just we can go forward a slide. It'll just unpack the detail a little bit for us. Thank you. So this idea that you can educate and drive awareness and sort of really kind of encourage action, but that on its own is not sufficient. What you need to be able to do is you need to be able to lead people to relevant, fit-for-purpose solutions. If we advance the slide, Bobby, thank you. To really kind of give them tools, right, to address that lack of agency or to find paths to exit in circumstances which are higher risk. And then finally, to say, if you're hoping to really effect long-lasting change, you need to think about how do you, as an organization and in orchestration with other organizations, look for strategies to mitigate the occurrence and sort of continuation of abusive patterns of behavior. So those were really sort of three key takeaways that really informed what we call the initial phase of our work, which is really about awareness and advocacy. Thanks, Bobby, if we move on. And so on the 27th of April, we celebrate in South Africa Freedom Day, right? It's the day when we commemorate and recognize, I suppose, our hard-won freedom. It is the day we had our first democratic elections. I was a much younger Ramo then, but I remember it well. And on this day, as we're reflecting on our freedom as a society, we chose to ask a simple, very provocative question to say, yes, we're free as a nation, but how free are you? And so this question became the trigger and really the anchor for Bobby Free Advance, a survey that we encouraged South Africans of all genders, 18 and above, to take. Now, the survey itself was a 12-question version of the Scale of Economic Abuse framework, which is a 28 sort of, let's call it, point scale framework. The 12 question format obviously lended itself to the fact that this was a self-directed study, but had a acceptable amount of psychometric reliability for us to at least gain insights from and learnings from. And as Bobby presented to us at the beginning of the talk, it talks about those same sort of subscales of economic or financial abuse, right? Being control, sabotage, and exploitation. If we go on a slide further, Bobby, I'd love to share sort of how we thought about the survey and ultimately what we learned from it. So on completion of the survey would return one of 4 archetypes to the respondent, really representing, let's call it the spectrum, markers on the spectrum of financial abuse, from your independent voice, who is someone who enjoys incredible agency in a relationship, is a co-contributor, has joint decision-making abilities, has a degree of freedom in terms of the relationships that they can, nurture and enjoy, and is able to invest in themselves and their self-development, all the way to the unseen on the far end. And this is someone who is in a acutely abusive relationship where there is little, if any, financial agency. They're typically restricted. They cannot drive their own relationships. They're often isolated in that respect, and sort of really the points in between. And the intention of returning these archetypes was to then invite the participant or the respondent to indicate whether they would like to remain in a conversation with us and be provided resources, not just by us, but by many of our partners as well, who provide highly valuable tools and solutions for people impacted and affected by financial abuse. Thank you, Bobby. We can skip the slide. I think what I'll rather speak to is really our dashboard and our learnings. So as I mentioned, this initial phase for us was really about learning as much as we could from the survey. And I think it's really highlighted, not just in the survey. Certainly our intent was to take the survey as a sort of a directional signal and not so much as a statistical generalization, with the full intent to have qualitative conversations on the back of it, but ultimately build a body of evidence that would compel the development of really sort of targeted, considered, curated solutions. So just maybe to call out a couple of highlights from the dashboard before I close. So we had significant reach over a very sort of creative campaign that again asks us provocative question in different ways. Questions along the lines of if you can't spend your own money to buy a coffee, how free are you? Questions of that nature. So we reached over 31 million people. But you'll note that of the 31 million people that we reached, and of the just under 90,000 unique visits we attracted to our landing page, we only saw 630 people thereabouts begin the survey, which I think speaks less to indifference and more to the sensitivity of the topic as touched on by my colleagues, right? Moving from awareness in a campaign to a deeply interrogating self-assessment requires courage, I think, to some extent, particularly when the questions touch on something that is as socially loaded as financial abuse. Now, of those who did begin the survey, we saw a completion rate of 57%. We're happy with. We know that that is a rate that sits well enough above the benchmark for surveys of this nature. And I suppose what it told us about this is that once participants chose to engage, they tended to stay with it. And then finally, if we go to the next slide, Bobby, if we look at the archetype distribution, and again, this just reinforces the pattern from presentations seen earlier, it gave us pause in that nearly half of those identified as independent voices, with significantly fewer participants recognizing experiences of control or isolation. But again, I suppose this reflects that social desirability bias that we spoke to, that the notion of presenting my circumstances as they truly are, given the cultural weight and the social weight of this, I think that comfort, that cultural permission, if you will, I think still needs to be built. So yeah, I think taken together for us, these results, they show us that there is work to be done ahead, but we know we need to turn awareness into agency and ultimately insight into intervention. So it shows traction and it's positive to us. Thank you. Thanks, Bobby.
Thank you so much, Ramo. Very interesting. And it's always great to be reminded of what I appreciated about the approach once I kind of learned what you guys were doing was just even going ahead and taking this archetype approach, kind of recognizing that people are going to identify into different categories and that the services or actions that you might take as a financial service provider, might also be different for those people. So just before I stop sharing my screen, just want to raise your awareness of some additional webinars or conferences that are coming soon on this. There's the Global Summit on Economic Abuse on November the 18th. This is kind of like Financial Inclusion Week. It's a full day crossing the globe of speakers on economic abuse. And then during the European Microfinance Week, or now renamed the Inclusive Finance 2025, happening in Luxembourg and virtually on November the 13th. You can register for that event, and Amelia will be leading a session on financial abuse at that conference. Also, just want to draw your attention to the financial abuse playbook that we developed for financial institutions. This was primarily done for financial institutions in the US because we were looking for examples of what financial institutions were doing here and the actions that they could take. I invite you to look at that as just a resource that kind of lays out the different pathways that we think financial abuse or financial service providers can take on this issue. But since I know we're running low on time, I'm going to see if I can stop sharing my screen here so I can join the conversation. Broad question for everyone that I think is on all of our minds. I mean, one of the, interests of doing data collection is because we feel like we need the information to justify actions within the sector. But I wonder what you think are the implications of this data for the types of actions different financial service providers can take, or different stakeholders within the sector. Maybe Amelia, I'll start with you.
Yeah, and I think that actually relates to a question that Jayshree had in the live discussion about what do financial service providers say about this. So certainly a future action from SPTS perspective is raising awareness of this. And we need to think about how to integrate this kind of content into our standards in terms of defining this as a customer protection problem and defining the actions that financial service providers can take. And that gets to what Jayshree was saying is for sure things like your policies around ID that you present, or if you need to be the owner of the land, for example, or the registered name on the business, anything about a guarantor. There are different policies that directly relate to then confidentiality versus making a spouse or partner aware. So we need to think about that information and make sure that we can disseminate it as broadly as possible to raise more awareness. And then I would also say just continuing to do this kind of research to underscore the point that I made earlier of, it's one thing to say, okay, this happens in the Philippines or this happens in whatever those other countries, but they didn't do the research in my country. And there's something psychologically about knowing that it's happening in your own country that makes it more real. So those are my two hoped for actions, is one to, to get more research in more countries done, and also to really integrate this kind of information into the standards, the management standards for customer protection that we then bring to financial service providers to start those discussions about how they can mitigate this risk for their customers.
Great, thank you, Amelia. William, what about your perspective from IPA?
Yeah, great. I mean, I'll be brief because I agree with Amelia, and the point on collecting data in your particular market is, I think, an important one and something that we're aiming to do. And I've really touched on my other point already, so I'll keep this brief. But I think measuring these types of questions is a really hard thing to do. And so while we should be taking action now, and it was really exciting to hear Ramos speak about all of the activities that he and Nedbank are taking on, we do need to do a better job of figuring out how to monitor these things and address some of the issues that we see in the data that's come out thus far. Some sort of surprising results in terms of men reporting these issues more than women, and what that suggests in terms of willingness to report versus underlying data sources or underlying differences. So I think that there's work to be done in terms of understanding how to measure this through survey data, but also through other sources of data, qualitative work. But you could also imagine accessing complaints data from service providers and looking at sort of unusual transaction patterns to try to pull out indicators of these types of risks. So I think as we take action, we also need to improve our measurement of these issues.
Great, thank you, William. Ramo, you get the last word on this question.
What a question it is. Thank you, Bobby. I suppose reflecting on the inputs from our colleagues, Bobby, the one thing I would add is, I suppose as financial institutions, we have a natural tendency to respond to opportunities to intervene from a solution development point of view, not dissimilar to the story I shared about our ultimate intent, albeit that we're in an awareness phase. But what we're also, and I think financial institutions need to be equally awake to, is the unintended harm created by existing products, services, and client interactions in existing products, and saying, it would serve us well to lean on subject matter experts and the like, who are able to help us evaluate how we may be unintentionally creating situations where people impacted or affected by financial abuse are harmed further because of policy and because of some of the requirements and regulations we impose to our products. I think is worth looking at. That said, I also think perhaps as a last thought, by being mindful of the time that we have left, is, and we try to remind ourselves this all the time, is what is that higher order end goal? While it might be to meet someone who's impacted and affected by financial abuse where they are, it's a question of how do we orchestrate this ring of steel, for want of a better word, recognizing that as a financial institution, our expertise starts and ends with financial expertise, but a comprehensive, holistic response that's going to position somebody to thrive who was once in this position requires a far more comprehensive, let's call it, mobilization of capability. And I think that's important to say, actively look for strategic alliances, for allies who can bring their capabilities to bear on what is a wickedly challenging thing. But yeah, thanks, Bobby.
Yeah, no, thank you. I know that we're at time. I just want to acknowledge the other comment about maybe looking at the question about silent treatment. I think we're, like we've all said here, I think we're still under the exploration of the types of questions that are really going to reveal the different forms and experiences of financial abuse. And so we will definitely take that into consideration. Just want to thank everybody for being with us today, and to my co-panelists for bringing all of this great data together. And I look forward to maybe next year being able to share more examples like Nedbank and what financial institutions are actually doing and the actions that they're taking. So just want to thank everybody for their participation today, and enjoy the rest of Financial Inclusion Week.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Wonderful. Thank you.